Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for actually doing your best to keep the lunch break short. I know that we had a couple of sessions that sort of ran over schedule this morning, but without further ado, I'd like to begin the last quarter of this year's Bosphorus Summit. It is the second half of day 2 here in Istanbul. We're going to be talking about the EU candidates' security dilemma, specifically the Western Balkans. And before I hand the floor over to Professor Günver Turan, I'd like to invite to the stage the keynote speaker for this section, the Deputy Foreign Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Turkey. I'd like to invite Mr. Faruk Kaymakcı.
Thank you very much. Sevgili Gül Hanım, dear panelists, dear participants, I hope we will have a session after this heavy lunch, which can be interactive and interesting. Since our time is limited, I will limit my remarks to maybe less than 10 minutes. I will try. When I look at the title of this session, I was a little bit puzzled, EU candidates, security dilemma, the Western Balkans. I said, is there any dilemma? I couldn't find any dilemma from the candidate countries' perspectives because they all want to be members of the EU. Maybe one candidate country is not quite sure about NATO, that is Serbia, but the rest, they don't have dilemma towards the EU. Inside, I think we have some dilemmas. We have economic security issue because the Balkan states are still facing difficulties in terms of corruption, in terms of better functioning market economies. And also among some of the so-called Western Balkans, I say so-called Western because Turkey is also one of the Balkan states and there is no southern, northern Balkans. Why we call it Western Balkans? Because this is a terminology actually invented by the EU to discriminate Turkey from the rest of the candidate countries. But now I think the EU will be puzzled because the number of candidate countries have increased to 10, including Ukraine and Moldova, and also, I would say, Georgia, which was given EU accession perspective. So, we have security dilemmas, maybe. We have an issue between Kosovo and Serbia. Bosnia-Herzegovina is not that stable, despite the fact that they came so close to NATO, and they are now closer to the EU accession negotiations. Then, of course, we have other candidate countries who have already joined, NATO. So we have this, but the real real dilemma is in the relation between the candidate countries and the EU. And I call it anchor credibility dilemma. The EU is not displaying, a serious anchorship towards the candidate countries. And there are some reasons or explanations for this. First, the EU is too tired of the enlargement. Second, the EU is more and more complicated. Third, we have populism in most of our countries, but especially in the EU countries about the EU enlargement. Then, of course, we have another issue which is more serious. That is the abuse of the veto right by some member states of the EU against the candidate countries. I'm not only talking about Turkish case where we have veto abuse, but also the case which is related to Albania and also to northern Macedonia. And actually this is for 25 years. It is not something of late, but it is a long abuse of the veto right. And of course we have also seen the position of Bulgaria, which delayed the start of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. So this is the EU side. But when it comes to the candidate country side, we do not have a credible membership policy. Can we say that because the EU is not displaying anchorship, we should not have a credible membership policy? I don't know. Of course, the EU accession perspective helps a lot the candidate countries to make faster reforms, to make more comprehensive reforms, but at the same time, the candidate countries are not doing sufficiently well to make progress in the accession negotiations. So when we look at the 6 Balkan states, for example, still there is too much to be done. Also, it includes Turkey. Yes, it is true that we made a lot of progress. We have opened 16 chapters and closed 1, but still we need to make progress in terms of remaining chapters, in terms of Copenhagen political criteria, so that we achieve, the end goal, which is full membership. So, when we look at again, all of the candidate countries, we do not see a credible, approach towards membership. Of course, they make some progress, but at the same time, we see some backsliding, and this has to change. For Turkey, the Balkans, is a region which is so important because it connects Turkey with the rest of Europe. But also we have historical ties. We have now a lot of investment. Turkish investment level in the 6 Balkan states actually is around, 11-12 billion dollars. When we include all of the Balkan states, Turkish investment level is $20 billion. And with all the Balkan states, we have a trade level of $23 billion. Sometimes this level of relationship with the rest of the Balkans is seen as a threat, as a challenge, as a destabilizing factor by the EU. And sometimes Turkey is compared to Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in the Balkans because we just restore one mosque, because we have so close relations. But we strongly believe and we confirm that our policy towards the Balkans are more or less, the same, and we fully support Euro-Atlantic integration of the Balkans, including Turkey, and we hope that our future will be together, hopefully in an enlarged geopolitical EU. Thank you very much.
We're changing things about the way things have operated until now because we've asked the keynote speaker to sit among us to answer 2 questions before I start answering questions, asking questions to my panelists. So one of the persons who wanted to ask a question to our ambassador or minister is Dimitar Bechev, who is from Bulgaria, who is a lecturer at Oxford University, who also writes for Carnegie Mellon, isn't it? And so, Dimitar, what is your question?
Well, thanks a lot. It's great to be here with you, and thank you, Mr. Deputy Minister, for the presentation. I definitely share your view that Turkey is not an outsider, and it's not fair to be compared to the others, the likes of China or Russia. It's part of the Balkans. So my question would be about how Turkey interacts with the EU in the region. What would be areas where interests collide, and what would be areas where actually cooperation is going forward? And in those areas of, say, friction, what can be done to improve the synergies with the EU?
Thank you very much. Actually, I do not expect any friction because, you know, there are different ways of improving our cooperation with the EU in the Balkans. First of all, Turkey should be invited to all meetings with the candidate countries, which means already 6, Balkan states plus Turkey, and now plus Ukraine and Moldova, and hopefully, Georgia as well. So this is one area. The second thing is that we have already Southeast cooperation process in which Turkey plays an active role. And actually, Turkey is quite flexible in terms of doing business and acting fast in the Balkans. And this is why maybe some of the member states are a little bit jealous, because we are fast in opening banks. For example, Turkey's major banks are giving microcredits in Serbia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo. So I think there is a lot that we can cooperate, from energy to trade, and from tackling COVID pandemic to radicalization. So there is a potential, but the only thing is that the EU should clearly see Turkey as a stabilizer, as a partner in the Balkans, and also as a candidate country to join the EU. I think when we have this understanding, the cooperation will be immense, and it will also accelerate the membership process of the Balkan states to the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Daskalovski had also a question, and I think I'll let him phrase it.
Sir, my question relates to the EU accession of Turkey. Of course, we all know that Turkey is the country with the longest period of waiting, becoming a candidate country, and then starting negotiations 2005, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken. Well, you used to have a ministry, I think in 2011 you had a ministry for European Union Affairs. Now, as far as I know, this is a directorate in your ministry, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My question is whether civil servants in general in Turkey and persons in your ministry are tired of this process, of this EU attitude of neglect and ignorance, and whether in general the Turkish state follows the acquis communautaire, passes the laws in your parliament, and follows all these new rules and regulations Brussels passes within the EU.
Interesting question. Moving from the Ministry for EU Affairs to Directorate for EU Affairs does not make any change in Turkey's EU policy. And the Ministry of EU Affairs, was converted into a directorate because of the fact that in the presidential system, the number of ministries have been reduced from 25 to 16. So this is the reason. But the former EU ministry is still there with the same structure, and actually with the more crowded, personnel, and also with some strong policy. So we are still trying to accelerate the reforms on the one hand. We are trying to align with the EU acquis, since we cannot open and close chapters, but we still try to align with the EU acquis. We are working with the EU in terms of IPA, financial cooperation, and EU programs, plus we have a communication. So we are communicating the needs of EU membership to the EU side, but also we try to explain to the Turkish nation what the EU membership means and what the EU membership doesn't mean. So it is still there, it is still active. Yes, it is true that because the process had been too long, there is some sort of demotivation. There is also some sort of questioning. But you have to ask 3 questions. The first question, do you want Turkey to be a member of the EU? You can check with our Professor Aydın here. He had a recent, survey over Turkey. So 75.9, let's say 76% of Turkish people, they want to see Turkey in the EU. When you ask, the second question, do you think Turkey can join the EU? Which means, is Turkey capable of joining the EU? Do you think that Turkey is serious about joining the EU? Then it goes down to 58%, which is still quite good. But the question is, do you think that membership of Turkey to the EU is currently possible? Then you get 10-15%. So this is because of the motivation, but what is important is the will of the nation. Turkish nation is interested in EU membership, and Turkish nation supports Turkey's EU reforms. So that is what is important. And I think the EU directorate is quite active and aggressive in terms of communicating, but of course with stronger and concrete reforms, our case can be better explained to the other side of Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I had intended to take you and analyze the EU vortex of security and defense policies that had been put together in the past 20 years. But what I can, because the title of our topic was Security Dilemmas in the Western Balkans. And when you're talking about security, you're talking about defense. When you're talking about defense, you're talking about military operations. But today, not everything is about war or military operations, because we live in a cyber world where you have cyber attacks, and the EU has had to tangle with security issues, cyber security issues, and has put together various policies, various programs, various policies that try to protect individuals, institutions, and states. For example, the European Union has undertaken today almost 37 operations, of which 18 are still in existence, and of which 2 deal with the Western Balkans. One is a military operation which is called EUFOR Althea, which takes place in Bosnia-Herzegovina since 2004. And the second one, which is more oriented to non-military activities, which takes place in Kosovo, which is an EU role of law mission, which was launched in 2008. So what we intend to discuss here is the impact these cyber and military policies of the EU, which is encompassed within the European what you would call the defense policies of the European Union, we will be discussing the impact these policies have had on the Western Balkans, as well as the role Russia, China, Turkey, which are actors out of the scope of the Western Balkans, their influence on them. When we talk about Western Balkans, we're talking about 6 countries. We're talking about Albania, we're talking about North Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, we're talking about Serbia and Montenegro. So my first question was going to be to Dimitar Bechev, and I was going to ask him the following question. When I look at the disputes between Western Balkan countries, are they normal interstate disputes, or is there some more fundamental ideological differences, which at the end might cause defense and security issues?
Well, there's this one real dispute. Everything else is symbolic or minor, and the one real dispute is Kosovo, because we are talking about sovereignty and territorial control, and this is for real. It's not the Bulgarian-Macedonian issue, which is a bit abstract, or the Greek-Macedonian issue for that matter. It's not even Bosnia, where Croatia has some claims on the electoral system. It's, as you've seen over the past couple of weeks, those who follow Kosovo, now people are resigning from Kosovo institutions. I mean, this is the real deal. And that's why in Kosovo, it's NATO taking care of security. It's not the EU. There is no EU peacekeeping mission. And by the way, Turkey is still there. I was a couple of weeks ago in Camp Bonstil. This is the big American-run NATO facility in the middle of Kosovo. And guess what? There's a Turkish flag there, because you have Turkish peacekeepers with NATO. And by the way, Turkey is contributing to the mission in Bosnia as well. So this is for real. And the question is whether the EU can help facilitate a settlement. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening, despite the agreement in 2013. What the EU is doing is to troubleshoot, to solve one crisis at a time, but there is no long-term vision. And I don't see either Serbia or Kosovo, and maybe Stevan will have interesting insight to share, committed to finding a solution. There was this moment with the Trump administration when the Americans got involved, and they proposed, or they played with the idea of a territorial partition, and the EU was against, and I understand why. But it's now the ball in the court of the EU to push forward the process. Josep Borrell thinks it will be moving forward. Miroslav Lajčák, who is the international envoy, thinks about it. But to be honest, I don't see real political will in either Pristina or Belgrade for a difficult but still needed political settlement that will unlock a positive dynamic.
Well, hopefully, let's hope for the best. Zhidas, what about you? You know that, do you agree with Dimitar on this issue?
I think basically the credibility of EU in dealing with Western Balkans is at question. I would even say is largely diminished in recent years. When my colleague Dimitar talked about Serbian-Albanian relations in Kosovo, of course, we should remind ourselves that these two governments had an agreement mediated by EU called Brussels Agreement. What happened with the Brussels Agreement? Well, many of the issues were settled, except one which was, and it is most important for the Serbian side, which is the so-called setting up the association of communities where Serbs live basically in majority in Kosovo. Of course, Serbs live in the north of Kosovo as a majority, but also in the south. But in any case, so this may be a small detail, but it's very crucial in the perception of EU in Belgrade and in Serbia. And it stops seeing EU as a credible actor when it cannot basically push Kosovo to fulfill this obligation. Maybe President Trump could have done that, but well, he's now not president of the United States, and we'll see what will happen next time when America has elections. But in meanwhile, EU has lost a lot of credibility, and these recent events where ethnic Serbian policemen in the Kosovo forces have refused to work for the Kosovo authorities is also because there are two different interpretations of what is this country. And I think Dimitar here is right. This is basically an issue of sovereignty. On one side, Pristina sees this as an independent state. Of course, this is legitimate and it's their own view. Belgrade and Serbia and the Serbs in Kosovo see Kosovo as part of Serbia. Again, legitimate from their point of view. So the question is whether the recent incidents were on minor issues about license plates, whether the license plates will be, let's put it simply, issued by authorities which are recognized by Kosovo or by authorities recognized by Serbia. But still, again, it all hinges upon the process which EU initiated, and it was called Brussels process, Brussels negotiations, and it did not lead to anywhere. So I will end with this sentence, maybe to further provoke discussions. I think the single most dangerous element in not providing security in the Western Balkans is the policy of the EU towards the region. Not only on this matter about the Brussels agreement, about Pristina-Belgrade relations, but also about the enlargement process, about relations with EU members which blocked the process, about relations with Turkey as a member, as a potential member country, and so on. But I guess maybe we can talk about this later. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stevan Gajich, I'm going to ask you the following question. If tomorrow all 6 countries were to become a member of the European Union, would the fighting that goes on right now continue, or will it be resolved in more peaceful ways?
Back in 2011, I was on a similar conference in Slovenia. It was called Bled Security Forum. And I asked the question to now late Mr. Erhard Busek regarding basically the same issue. I was trying to communicate a message that obviously wasn't heard. I said that a new generation of Serbs has arrived, that this is a generation brought up in an environment of in a post-war environment, and that this generation only saw Serbia constantly appeasing basically the Western demands and not receiving next to nothing for that. And I said, I cited, actually paraphrased a famous sentence by Jack Nicholson in Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, where he says, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I said, all sticks and no carrots makes Jack a dull boy. And besides that, the carrots aren't sweet anymore. So the Serbs have been viewed by the West from, I would say, a very hostile perspective, and there was a self-fulfilling prophecy. We were constantly viewed as the little Russians on the Mediterranean. And guess what happened? So we have a completely new reality now. In 2000, right after NATO aggression against us, majority, I would say, of Serbs were more than 80% were pro-EU, and even the NATO accession percentage was quite high. It was never more than 50%, but still it was very high, especially having in mind that the wounds were quite fresh. Now, less than 20% of people on a maximum are for joining NATO, and we have a stably high percent of people who are against joining the EU. And when the question is phrased, would you join the EU tomorrow and give up sovereignty over Kosovo and Metohija in exchange, some 80% of people are categorically against that.
Against.
Against, yes. So the EU is, first of all, it's not, I would say, a tasty fruit anymore. It's not really, it lost its, let me use an antique word, it lost its eros that it used to have. And also, it is a rump organization after 2016. Now the Franco-German led EU is being constantly, it's a punching bag for London and Washington and even Kiev. And they are constantly being asked to pay, but they never play. And we can see that, you know, with these symbolic moves. For instance, after what happened with the Nord Stream, I hear a very loud silence. I don't see that the German side is really trying to investigate what actually happened. And Scholz is constantly being pressured by NATO and even, as I said, by Kiev. So the EU is seen as an impotent player, and also as a player that is not capable to really implement its policies. The mentioned Brussels Agreement of 2013 and of 2015 was ratified even by the interim institutions in Pristina, and Serbs gave the telecommunications, they forced, and this was really hard to be done. Belgrade actually forced Serbs in Kosovo and Metohija to join the institutions of a state that we presumably don't recognize, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot being given, and only one accession, which I don't think is really a big deal, is this community of Serbian municipalities that was supposed to be not only the interim institutions actually obliged themselves to implement that, and they're refusing to do that. So if we have this really single-sidedness, what should the EU expect from the Serbs? Thank you.
So internal divisions will continue whether you're EU members or not. When we were discussing at lunch, you were telling us that the Western Balkans doesn't seem to be in the agenda of academicians. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Mustafa Aydın from Kadir Has University, is there any chance that one of your publications will be allocated to the issue of studying Western Balkans? I know that you're preparing something on Russia and Turkey, so could the next topic of your could be the Western Balkans? Do you know any academician in Turkey who is specialized in the analysis of the Western Balkan countries?
Well, the answer to your second question is yes. There are few who are very specifically working on the Balkans. However, they are not at the forefront of the agenda or the discussions because Balkans, unfortunately, doesn't appear on the Turkish, let's say, media attention. It's relegated to the secondary tier in the even in the academic discussions. Secondly, also the academic people who are working on the Balkans usually focus on kind of Turkey's historical connections and or Turkey's economic relations, which are okay, sufficient in itself, but it's not enough to bring attention, public attention. Usually public in Turkey looks into areas where Turkish foreign policy has some sort of a, let's say, problem or a new initiative. And the Balkans, I think, kind of remains, well, luckily, I think, out of this purview. The answer to your first question is, yes, absolutely, we would like to do something, but that depends on, as you know, funds. If there are people who are willing to fund this kind of research, I'm sure myself and my collaborators will be happy to conduct something on the Balkans. We just finished, the minister just mentioned that we finished research on Turkish public's perceptions on Europe in general, which I would say includes Balkans as well. But still, in Turkish psyche, it seems the research also shows that Balkan countries somehow remains, within quotation marks, remains out of Balkans. And this is not only historical perception, and I think it also reflects the current reality. Turkey shares these unfortunate characteristics with so-called Western Balkan countries of being invited to European Union as a member, but not encouraged to move forward. So let me stop there to your question.
Deputy Minister, you know, we've listened to the first 5 minutes I had allocated to our panelists. Do you have any comments on what was said up till now?
For giving me the floor again. Yes, I do have. First, I think one of our colleagues said that EU is not a tasty fruit. I don't think that EU wanted to be a tasty fruit at all. So EU is a sour taste and healthy fruit. So, you know, if you care for it, it's sour, but it makes you healthy if you take it. So it is not so sweet. On the question of deterrence, you know, I would like to underline, on the question of security and defense in Europe, and especially in the Balkans, yes. As my colleague mentioned, I mean, Turkey is the biggest contributor to EU Althea operation, and we are also contributing a lot in Kosovo, and we used to contribute a lot to the CSDP missions of the European Union. But lately, unfortunately, we have not been invited because of the tension between Turkey and Greece or the EU, I don't know. But okay, EU calls it the tension. So we are not invited anymore to, you know, important CSDP missions. And in addition to that, we are not invited to join military mobility of PESCO in the EU system. I think it's a big pity because Turkey is the second biggest army of NATO. And I claim that if Turkey had been a member of the EU, NATO and the EU would act together. And this would create a strong deterrence, and this would even prevent the war, the Russian war against Ukraine. I think because of the lack of deterrence in the West, because of, you know, cooperation between the EU and NATO, Russia, you know, felt so easy and comfortable in invading, in attacking another European state in our continent. I don't know whether Mr. Ilden would agree with me, but I think an EU member, Turkey, would mean, you know, EU and NATO acting as one, and this would really create real deterrence. What we need, I think, in Europe is deterrence. We need to have the operations outside of Europe. But in Europe, we need deterrence. And unfortunately, we missed this one. In terms of Balkan policy, of course, maybe the academicians do not write too much, but I can assure you that I am also in charge of the Balkans in the ministry. I would say that 1/3 of our efforts in Europe is devoted to the Balkans. We have, if you look at the number of visits paid by the Turkish officials, it is mostly to the Balkan states. And actually, we are in a position to speak to 3 leaders of the Bosnia-Herzegovina, you know, be it Serb, be it Bosniak, be it Croat. And, you know, we have mechanisms, bilateral, trilateral, which helps even between Kosovo and Serbia. We are doing our best, for example, to get rid of this crisis about the electricity in the north. So sometimes, you know, it is not so visible, But I can say that it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of attention, at least from the diplomatic point of view. So I will stop here.
Thank you. Very many new actors are active in the Western Balkans. So, Mr. Daskalovski, I know that you have been writing about China's involvement in the Western Balkans. What has been the impact of this new actor? And besides China, Japan also is very active. How can you explain the way they have entered both the markets and how the impact that they now have on the economic policies of the countries they have been active in?
Well, China, compared to Japan, is a major player in the Western Balkans, but only if you compare to what Japan does, of course. It's Chinese policy basically ever since this whole project was started, BRE, Belt and Road Initiative, to develop economic traffic, trade routes to various countries in Asia, leading all the way to Europe. One of these routes is basically going through the Western Balkans, and it's something which is important in terms of future trade of China, not with the Western Balkan countries, but basically with the countries of the EU. So, in principle, the Western Balkans are only part of the Chinese policy in Europe. China had this 16 plus 1, 17 plus 1 initiative. Now it's 14 plus 1, okay. Of course, this initiative which aimed at establishing links with specific countries in Europe which are willing to deal with trade with China and sort of having them in the future as potential allies within the whole European Union. You know, once you trade, once you have good relations in trade, maybe you can have favorable opinions expressed within Brussels bureaucracy of the European Union. But in the Western Balkans, there is only one country which is important for China, and the one country which is the main recipient of Chinese investments, main recipient of Chinese attention, if you will. This country is, of course, Serbia. What is important for the security of the region is that China recently, after this whole Russian attack on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, whatever you call it, started, China shipped military arms, including these S-300 rockets, which Russia produces, but China also
It's
does
an equivalent.
their
It's
own
called
version.
FK3.
Sorry?
The Chinese equivalent is called FK3,
So
but
yes,
it's the same thing.
Yes, the same thing, the FK3. So in terms of security, this was probably China's signal that somehow Serbia is a client, and maybe if relations are not so good for Russia, or if things are not developing so good for Russia that it can take care of its own client Serbia in the Balkans, China will. This was one interpretation, of course, but in principle, China's investment in the region, China's focus, China's attention is mainly in Serbia, and also in the Serbian part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the so-called Republika Srpska entity. Much less China has invested in Albania, in Macedonia, in Kosovo, nothing at all, because China does not recognize this as an independent country. So it's of course a big question what the future will bring, but if the EU does not focus its own energy on speeding up the enlargement process, my worry is that China will have bigger and bigger role in influencing Belgrade's policies. Thank you.
Dimitar, I saw you smile a bit. Why did you?
No, I mean, it's the Chinese piece is really important, but we shouldn't lose sight of the economic fundamentals. That EU is by far the biggest economic player. It accounts for something like 70% of trade with the region, and not to mention FDI, and then of course you have to bring in mind remittances, all sorts of connectivities. The same, by the way, applies to Turkey. Despite the hiccups in the negotiation process, if you look at the economy and society, the links are really deep. So my colleague Georg knows, in the good old days, used to say that Turkey and the EU is like a Catholic marriage. There is no divorce. And the same could be said about the Western Balkans and the EU. They belong together. One connection you see, by the way, I was reminded, is that in EU institutions, you have lots of people of Turkish origin that have citizenship of member states. And I'll give you one example. A friend of mine who is the rapporteur for North Macedonia, the European Parliament, İlhan Küçük. I disagree with his party, I don't support them, but he's doing a great job in difficult time to carry the flag and to push for North Macedonia's membership. And this shows how critical those connections are. My second point is, because we're talking about security, there's the economic dimension of security. And this is where we are in trouble, because EU is going to recession. I mean, it's very clear. And when the EU sneezes, the Western Balkans catch cold. It takes some time for the pain to trickle down, but it does trickle down. This is the lesson from 10 years ago, when Serbia had triple-dip recession. I mean, it took some time for the domino effect. And you see the signs now. The World Bank projects that growth in the Western Balkans will be halved next year. After COVID, we had a bounce back of 7% for the region. Now it's down to something like 3%. Because there will be less money coming by way of investment. There will be less demand from German car factories for components in the Western Balkans. But it shows interdependence. Now the challenge for us on all sides, given the political constraints, is how to upgrade this relationship. Given that membership is a long-term objective, for reasons we know, can we find areas we can work together? And one example would be the green transition, which also applies to Turkey. And let me stop here just to put it on the table, the economic dimension of security, and we can probably...
Stefan, you disagreed, I think, but then you will also have to talk about Russian impact on Serbia, their involvement in Serbia.
I'd like to say some words about China first. This is the first year when the investments of China are larger than the combined investments of EU. And I think this is a very significant, let's say, threshold. So I do believe that while maybe it is more attractive to talk about the Russian influence in Serbia, when we look at the numbers and at the investment, China is by far the largest growing investor into Serbia. And yes, I think that Zhidas' remark about the deployment of the arms were a very strong political signal to our partners, let's call them that, from the West, who, what China was trying to communicate is, don't think that this territory is enchanted if Russia is kept busy. Speaking of Russia, I think also that there is a big misconception and a big, that the problem is with the framing of the question. Usually, the way people like to think about it is that there is some genius at Lubyanka, the center of FSB or former KGB, that are waging magnificent hybrid warfare in Serbia so that their influence is high. But if they were such geniuses, how come that Maidan of 2004 happened in Ukraine? And then it repeated in 2013 and 14 in a region which is much more important for Russia. It is a high priority of first class, where Russia invested much more money. I mean, it is uncomparable, the investment into Ukraine with the investment even until today into Serbia. Yes, they bought the oil industry and some other industries. They are also present together with the Chinese when it comes to the rebuilding of infrastructure and so on and so forth. Sputnik exists in Serbia, but it exists in a number of other countries as well. But I don't think that we are taught that this is that they have this super soft power which is functioning. We need to look at the specifics of Serbia. There was a popular, I just want to make a historical parallel just to put things into perspective. There is a popular theory about the coup d'etat that happened in 1941 on March 27th in Belgrade. So basically, the king at the time, Peter, he was underage, so there was this collective government which signed the treaty with Hitler. So the popular theory is, it is all the British who organized the generals and the Serbs. So that's why all of the population of Belgrade went out to protest. Where in fact, if Germany was so popular, then nobody could really make all those people come out on the street. So the thing is that if you don't have the context that already exists, soft or hard power doesn't really work. The pre-context is that there is a lot of frustration and resentment by the way that the West behaved towards the Serbs for the last 22 years. I think that there was a window of opportunity for West, both for NATO and EU, between 2000 and 2008. And I think it was shut down in 2008. So that is why now it is easier to blame somebody else and to say that, to create this monster saying how Russians are so cunning when it comes to Serbia, and not to think about A, B, and C that happened before that. And I just think that today we are stuck, of course, with a security dilemma. Yeah, sorry.
So I think, I'm going to ask Professor Aydın, how does Turkey contribute to what is happening in the Western Balkans? Is it mainly economic, or is it also social, or can it also involve political actions that might influence what's happening in the Balkans?
I think all of the above, and even more. When people looking into Turkish actions in the Balkans and trying to evaluate it, they usually start from a kind of a historical connections and emphasize Turkey's historical connections to the Balkans and the peoples in the Balkans. But it always goes beyond that, and I'm always fascinated to see Turkish foreign policy, including its economic policy towards the region, has always been influenced by pragmatism. There has always been, since the end of the Cold War, a sense of pragmatism and a focus on economic benefits, mutual benefits. And we can see this very clearly that as the biggest trade partner of Turkey is Serbia in the Western Balkans. Conventionally, you might think that Turkey might have identity problems with Serbia and Serbian people, but it's not the case. So this clearly shows how Turkey looks and approaches to the region. And I think Turkish contribution could even be increased, addressing what I might call the three problems. One is the attention deficit. This includes Turkey and Europe. Unless there is a rise of tensions in the region or some sort of a possibility of a conflict, both EU countries and Turkey neglects the region and starts overlooking the region to each other, actually. So that's problem one. The second is, I think the region is still a work in progress, which leaves the region in a position of what I would call in-betweenness, between the European Union and something else. That something else could be Turkey, could be Russia, or even distant China, but still is in between. And the third is, region is a truly transit, it's a region in transit itself, of course. changing its character, economy, politics, and everything, but also it's a region for transit, ideas, trade, drugs, refugees, and during the Syrian war, also fighters. So Turkey could, and I think it started addressing these issues, but could address even more. So if you look at, for example, visa-free travel for Turkish business people or for Turkish people, increasing development aid to the region, free trade agreements with all the regional countries, and cooperating and partnering with the regional initiatives, the initiatives that are developed within the region instead of brought by the outsiders. So Turkey is contributing and could, I think, contribute more from this perspective. And finally, there are a couple of aspects that I think we have seen in recent years that Turkey might explore further. One is the energy dimension. Now everybody keep talking about energy deficit of Europe. And where are we going to get more energy to Europe? Through Turkey and through the Balkans. I mean, anything that goes through Turkey has to go through Balkans. And if EU has any sense left, they should be exploring the Turkish road. The second is what some people call middle road between China and EU. And again, that goes through Turkey and the Balkans, which connects these regions together. And again, I think EU and Turkey should invest more. And finally, refugee management. We are not talking about that much here, but we have seen this problem, and it's not only the Syrian refugees which goes through Turkey to the Balkans, but now it's the Ukrainian refugees, a different type of refugees, but nevertheless, they are refugees. And Turkey has a huge experience here, which can contribute to management of refugees to the Balkan countries. And I'll give one last example and finish. Even during the days of the COVID-19, we have seen when the European Union collapsed in the early days of COVID-19, we have seen Turkish aid, health aid, moving into the Balkans very rapidly. So these are kind of areas that Turkey could contribute with emphasis on its regional ownership, which we tried in the Black Sea in the 1990s. It worked. The idea of regional ownership always motivate the regional countries more to collaborate. And second, inclusiveness, not to leave any country out or any ethnicities, any group out. So these are, I think, ways that Turkey could contribute more.
Thank you, Professor Aydın. Dimitar has something to say about energy routes, I'm sure.
Yeah, I want to echo what Mustafa Bey pointed out very rightly about Turkey's role in energy, because ultimately the region and Turkey are in the same boat, because both import energy, they depend on imports. And one positive development we've seen over the past year is the opening of the Southern Corridor. So now Azerbaijani gas is reaching Italy, and as of last month also Bulgaria through Turkey. It's a matter of time before the connection between Greece and North Macedonia will be completed. So Turkey will become a transit country also for North Macedonia through Azeri gas. And this is really important because once you have natural gas coming, it's not only about Russia, it's also about replacing dirty coal burning facilities in the region. Because if you look at the Western Balkans, again, human security, most polluted cities in Europe, very high carbon intensive production. I mean, the statistics out there, I invite you to check all the tracking organizations. The region is in dire need of modernization, and new sources of energy is the way forward. And this connects to the Russian bit. A lot of people are kind of freaking out about Russian energy influence in the region, but they haven't done the maths. I mean, the Western Balkans actually consume very small amounts of Russian gas. We are talking of a market of 4 billion cubic meters per year. By comparison, Turkey consumes 60. So this is a factor of 15. Whereas the population of the Western Balkans is 1/5 of Turkey. So Turkey is a much bigger consumer of gas. That means that in the Western Balkans, there is potential for non-Russian suppliers to come in, to help modernize energy systems, and to push forward development. And Turkey, I think, can play a role. And there's Turkish investment. For instance, in Kosovo, the electricity grid is owned by Turkey, by, I think, Çalık Holding, isn't it? And there will be other opportunities as well. And therefore, we have to think about those synergies and how Turkey could benefit. And also thinking about not just the Western Balkans, and I'm really happy that Minister Kaymakcı made this point. We have to think about Southeast Europe as a whole. So in Southeast Europe, Turkey actually imports, or historically has been importing electricity. It depends on production. Turkey is doing a lot of business with the Eastern Balkans. If you look at the turnover with Romania, for instance, it overshadows anything done with the Western Balkans. So think about the larger geography, think about opportunities, and think about the future.
Stefan, I haven't forgotten you. I know you want to ask a question to our minister. Do ask it.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed Mr. Kaymakcı when you mentioned the term, when you problematized the term Western Balkans, and you were quite right. It was invented, I would say, by the EU before the EU ever existed. It was invented by the foreign minister of Austro-Hungarian Empire, Gyula Andrássy, with a very specific fear in mind, and it was the fear at the time of the declining Ottoman Empire and of the vacuum that might be fulfilled by Russia. So some things are, let's say, a constant. Ideologies change, let's say people change, technologies change, but geography doesn't change that quickly.
Ask the
my
question.
question is in this regard. My question is that I think that Turkey has found a very balanced policies in the latest crisis, and I think it is involved into building a new, let's say, world order with the new integration processes on whole of the Eurasian continent, where I think Serbs and Turks will meet again. What do you think about these perspectives? What do you think about the changes happening in the Middle East and the approach of Turkey towards it, especially talking about Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which have changed their policies, in my opinion, that was built since 1945, since the agreement on the Great Bitter Lake.
Stefan, this will require a whole new panel, and we've already passed our time. So
thank you.
Let me give you, Minister, the last word, and maybe
Yes,
you will
just
partly answer his
very
question.
briefly, since we talk about Southeast Europe, I think we should also, mention the island of Cyprus, where we have here the Turkish Cypriot minister with us. And I think since we talk about dilemma, there is one dilemma about energy security of Europe. While our, Greek Cypriot friends enjoy the beautiful Mediterranean sun, I don't know how many days, Minister, 300 days per year, we will be freezing, in North, West, and East Europe. If we face a major crisis next year, maybe this winter will be okay, but next winter we might have a problem. And I always say that hydrocarbon resources can be also a confidence-building measures between Turkish and Greek Cypriots if there is real intention of, compromise from our Greek Cypriot neighbors. And we mentioned Southern Gas Corridor, which can also be strongly supported by the Eastern Mediterranean hydrocarbon resources, including those from the island of Cyprus. On the other issues, of course, Turkey's motto is peace at home, peace in the world. Unfortunately, we had, some tensions with some of our neighbors, some of Middle Eastern countries. Now we are focusing also on the normalization. We hope that this will serve the interest of all sides, including, those of Europe. Thank you.
Well, I think we have finished. Our panel is now ready to move on and leave the floor to other panelists. I just want to say that after having listened to our panelists, instead of finding answers, I have found only questions. And the two questions that comes to my mind is as follows. Will Western Balkan countries remain committed to this enlargement, to becoming members of the European Union? And will the EU remain committed to this enlargement? So thank you all for having listened to our discussions. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for having joined us.
Professor Turan, thank you very much to you and Ambassador Kaymakcı as well. I'd like to invite to the stage Professor İlter Turan to actually present a token of appreciation. And I think that Professor Gül Turan also has some certificates for our panelists as well. Thank you very much. Yeah, they are filming you. Okay. Thank you very much to all of you for this nice discussion. We're going to pick up on a theme that was actually touched upon by Professor Turan in her session. Ambassador Kaymakcı, thank you very much. And that is of national security and the defense industry. I'd like to hand over the floor now to our next session. To moderate this will be Mr. Vahit Erdem. He is the Turkish Defense Industry's founding Undersecretary. Sayın Erdem, lütfen. As well as the panelists, Günver Şahin, Utku Aral, Nihat Aksüt, and Professor Mesut Hakkı Ceşun.